Yo, what's up, guys? It's Reed Young, aka Shuda here, going to be reviewing a hand that's in small stakes no limit on the Poker Forum 2+2. And the question the original poster has is about leading the river. So I know we've all been in this type of spot if you've played poker fairly regularly, where you improve your hand on the river and it kind of looks like you have what you have and your opponent isn't really going to be value betting thinly into you. Now, there's definitely some better examples where you might want to work in a river leading range, because on this board you can see the button raises and we call in the small blind, and a pretty draw heavy board gets bet twice by the button, and we're considering leading on the river. So I think in this case it's even more obvious that we should be check calling with a hand like this, trying to allow the button to value bet worse, as well as let him semi-bluff, or continue with his semi-bluffs on the turn some of the time. So we call the flop. I think that's completely standard. On the turn, I think we have a pretty easy call. And the river, we improved to trip nines, where our hand might look like trip nines, but I think if we consider our entire range, we just have a really good hand for our range. We could have something like ace 8 suited or pocket sixes, a few other hands like that we do need to protect. So if we are leading this river, you want to consider that you would also want to be doing it as a bluff as well. So maybe you could take some of the bottom portion of your range, stuff like ace 10 offsuit maybe, and turn that into a bluff by leading out on the river if you were to work in a leading range. But the problem is, even hands like ace 5 are good bluff catchers against our opponent's range. So what I mean by that is, if he's semi-bluffing the turn with something like queen jack, we're still ahead of it, so there's no reason to really stop a bluff here. So the only reason to lead is if our opponent would be making a larger mistake, like folding pocket jacks, if we led into him here. And I think for a lot of games that could be a reasonable assumption, and it's also something interesting to think about working into your game, because obviously there's so many rivers in certain situations that you could consider working a lead on, and they're not that common. So on this river in particular, an 8, a 9, and maybe a club you could consider leading, although I think a club makes by far the least amount of sense as far as stopping our opponent's other semi-bluffing hands. So if you bet the turn with a hand like queen jack on a river club, we might want to allow him to continue with his bluffs and value bet into our flush. And it also works good for the times that we want to check raise, bluff the river, and represent a backdoor flush. So leading, you have to think, cuts out all of these possibilities, and whether or not you can check call or check raise the river, I think is fairly opponent dependent. Really, I guess we shouldn't have that many nines in our range, so I think check raising could be fine, and this is really the top of our range, but I think that stems from how loose we played the hand pre-flop. I'm not really sure I'm on board with just flatting out of the small blind and only 100 big blinds effective with 9-7 suited, just because typically you're going to have a lot of these weird, break even-ish out of position turn spots. Like this hand is a prime example, where we're going to be facing a range of semi-bluffs that have, they're only like a 2-to-1 underdog, which isn't that bad considering they control the frequencies and the sizing for the river, and hands that have us pretty much annihilated. It's pretty rare that we're going to be check calling, flop and turn with a one pair hand that's very likely ahead of our opponent's value range. So just because they can have 10s and better, whereas with a pair of 9s or a pair of 7s, we don't beat any of those hands. And the lower the cards get, the lower your suited connectors, the more that becomes a factor. Obviously, calling from the small blind with something like queen 10 suited is a lot more defensible than calling with 9-7 suited. and that's just a good example of the reason and how domination is going to affect your pre-flop play and what hands you're going to be able to play well post-flop. So keeping in mind the reverse implied odds issue, I don't think that being able to lead the river really is going to cut into the value you might be giving up. So in other words, we can't really check call this turn very lightly, expecting that large of a percentage of rivers to be cards that we could then bluff on by leading. So what I mean by that is if you think you're making a super thin turn call with ace-10, not that much of the value from that call is going to be able to be attributed to turning your hand into a bluff on a river, just because, like we said earlier, there aren't that many rivers where you can represent a stronger hand than a lot of your opponent's value range. And that would be really the only point of turning any of those hands into a bluff. So basically, unless you think your expected value is greater than that of a check call, you shouldn't be leading it at all. And if you're just looking at it from the standpoint of this one hand, I could understand why you think this might be a lead. But if you think about your entire range and how it's going to be affected by you leading a hand like trips here, you're really going to be putting yourself in a lot of really tough river decisions, especially if you're going to be check calling with hands like a pair of eights on the turn. Since you didn't lead the river, your opponent's going to know you didn't have trips, so it's pretty easy to value bet extremely thinly and bluff pretty effectively with whatever size he thinks will get you to fold an 8, and he can balance his range accordingly to that size. So you're just going to get destroyed by a good player with a leading strategy on this river, unless you're doing a lot of other tricky stuff to balance it, and I'm not sure you're just going to have enough combinations of made hands to whittle your range down that far and play rivers by leading here. So I hope you guys like this video. If you're coming from Twitter, please retweet it. That would be awesome. And if you're on YouTube, there's a subscribe annotation on the top left if you want to see more hand reviews like this. And if you guys could like it, I would appreciate that. If we could get this video up to 30 likes, that would be sweet, because then more poker players see my channel on YouTube, and it makes it worth doing these videos for me. So if you guys want to see more, hitting that like button really goes a long way. Alright, thanks guys, take care.